The HOA painted an orange X on my oak and brought a crew to cut it down at 8:15 on a Saturday morning. They had a chipper idling by the curb, 2 cones in my driveway, and a tree service truck parked half on the grass like the job was already decided. The president of the board stood near the trunk with a folder under his arm, and that pleased. Official look people get when they think a clipboard has made them reasonable. The crew leader did not have that look. He had sawdust on his boots, a pencil behind one ear, and the tired patience of a man who had spent too many mornings finding out that someone in an office had described a tree differently than it existed in the ground. He read the work order once. Then he read it again. Grant Bellamy, our HOA president, said, "The association has approved removal under the safety provision. We are trying to keep this corridor clean and safe for everyone." That was the sentence he had been practicing for weeks. I could hear it. Clean and safe. Community corridor. Safety provision. Words polished smooth enough that the rough part was supposed to disappear. I looked at the crew leader and asked, "Does your packet include the protected tree clearance?" Grant turned toward me before the crew leader did. "Eleanor, this has already been reviewed." The crew leader's name was Marco Ruiz. He ignored Grant for a moment, which told me he had been in this business long enough to know where liability actually landed. He walked around the oak, looked at the orange X, then crouched near the root flare where the city canopy tag sat, half hidden behind a seam of old bark. He brushed 2 fingers over the metal tag and looked back at his work order. "I'm not touching this," he said. That was the moment everyone remembers, because it was the first honest sentence of the morning. But it was not where the story started. The story started with shade. When I bought my house on Larkspur Bend, I was 54, recently retired from the city planning office, and tired of buildings that came with elevators and committees. I wanted a 1-story house, a small kitchen with a window over the sink, and enough front yard that the street did not feel like it was sitting in my lap. The oak was the first thing I noticed. It stood near the edge of the front yard, broad and uneven, with 2 large limbs stretching toward the street and 1 low limb reaching toward the driveway. It was not a perfect tree. Perfect trees belong in brochures. This one had a scar where a limb had been removed years earlier, a shallow hollow near the base that held leaves after rain, and roots that lifted the grass in slow ridges like the ground had decided to remember where the tree drank. I loved it before I loved the house. In July, that oak dropped the temperature on the front walk by 10 degrees. In October, it covered the yard with acorns and leaves and made me sweep more than I wanted to. In spring, birds argued in it so loudly that I sometimes opened the window just to tell them they were being unreasonable. It shaded my front room, part of Nina Patel's west-facing windows across the street, and half the sidewalk where kids waited for the bus. The prior owner, Mr. Havel, had left a packet in the kitchen drawer with appliance manuals, paint colors, and a handwritten note that said, "Do not trench near oak. City tag in bark. Ask before cutting roots." That was all. Not dramatic. Not a treasure map. Just one practical sentence from a man who had owned the house for 30 years and knew what mattered. I put the note in my house file. That was habit. 32 years in municipal planning will do that to you. People hear planning office and imagine I spent my career drawing grand maps of future neighborhoods. Mostly, I reviewed site packets, checked setback lines, answered questions from people who had not read the second page, and watched small mistakes become expensive because someone treated a condition of approval as a suggestion. The oak was a condition of approval before I ever moved in. Larkspur Bend had been built in the late 80s, when the city was trying to keep old canopy trees from disappearing under cul-de-sacs and mail kiosks. The original subdivision approval included a tree preservation strip along the entrance side of the neighborhood. Several large trees were inventoried and tagged, Mine was one of them. For 4 years, nobody cared. Then Grant Bellamy became president of the HOA. Grant was not a villain in the way bad stories make people villains. He did not twirl his mustache. He did not scream. He remembered names, wore pressed shirts, and opened meetings by thanking volunteers. That was part of why people trusted him. He sounded organized. He made disorder feel like a personal insult. His favorite phrase was frontage harmony. He wanted the entrance corridor to look clean. Same mailbox posts. Same mulch color. Same trimmed shrubs. No leaning garden flags. No trash cans visible from the street. No overgrown visual clutter, which was a phrase that appeared in the newsletter 3 months before my first notice. My oak became visual clutter slowly. At first it was a comment after a meeting. Grant stood by the folding chairs in the clubhouse and said, "Eleanor, we may need to talk about your tree canopy at some point. It is getting a bit heavy over the walk." I told him I had a pruning company out every 2 years and would be happy to send the latest invoice. He smiled and said, "We are looking at the corridor as a whole." That sentence told me he was not really talking about branches. The first letter came 6 weeks later. Cream paper. HOA letterhead. Polite enough to make the threat feel accidental. Dear Miss Voss, the association has observed hazardous overhang, leaf accumulation, and sightline obstruction related to the mature oak located near the front boundary of your lot. Please submit a corrective action plan within 30 days. Hazardous overhang, leaf accumulation, sightline obstruction. There are 3 ways a person can respond to a letter like that. You can get angry, which feels good for about 10 minutes, and then gives the other side a quote. You can ignore it, which gives them a deadline. Or you can answer the exact problem they claim to have. I chose the third. I hired a certified arborist named Paul Ingram. He was not charming. I appreciated that. Charming people sometimes make trees sound like pets. Paul made them sound like structures. He walked the canopy, checked the root flare, noted 2 dead branches over the street, and examined the hollow at the base. He spent most of his time looking up, not talking. His report was 8 pages. The conclusion was clear. The tree was mature, structurally sound, and suitable for retention with selective pruning. He recommended removing deadwood, reducing weight on one lateral limb, and avoiding trenching or grade changes in the critical root zone. He did not recommend removal. I sent the report to the HOA through the portal. Then I sent it by certified mail, because portals are only reliable when nobody is embarrassed by what they contain. I offered 3 pruning dates. For a week, the portal showed a green checkmark beside my upload. That little checkmark became part of my morning routine. Coffee. Back door. Oak leaves on the walk. Portal checkmark. I knew it was silly. But people who have dealt with associations understand the comfort of a timestamp. It is not justice. It is just a small fence around the truth. The certified mail receipt arrived on a Tuesday. I clipped it to Paul's report and put both in the same folder as Mr. Havel's note. Then I went outside and did what Paul had told me to do, which was nothing dramatic at all. I looked at the actual tree. The 2 dead branches he had marked were easy to see once I knew where to look. One was thin and gray, angled toward the street. The other sat higher, tucked inside the canopy, where it looked harmless until the sun hit it. The low limb over the sidewalk had too much end weight, and Paul had flagged that too. Not dangerous today. Not an emergency, but worth reducing before storm season. That is the part Grant never wanted to discuss. I was not defending rot. I was not saying branches never fall. I was saying the cure should match the problem. If your porch step is loose, you repair the step. You do not bulldoze the house and tell everyone you acted for safety. The HOA's first reply came from the management company, not Grant. It thanked me for my submission and said the matter would be reviewed by the Architectural and Grounds Committee. The next line said the association reserved all rights under the governing documents. Associations love reserving rights. It sounds like action even when nobody has done anything. I replied with 3 available dates for pruning. I included Paul's license number, the proposed scope, and a note that the work would avoid the critical root zone. I also asked, plainly, whether the HOA had any certified opinion that contradicted Paul's recommendation. No one answered that question. Instead, Grant called me from his cell phone at 6:40 p.m. on a Thursday, which is the hour chosen by people who want a conversation to feel casual while still being official. Eleanor, I wanted to talk neighbor to neighbor, he said. That made me sit down at the kitchen table and pick up a pen. He said the board appreciated my cooperation. He said the report was helpful. Then he said the association was concerned that selective pruning would not address the broader corridor objective. The broader corridor objective is not the violation you sent me, I said. There was a pause. Not long, but enough. The board has to consider the community as a whole. Then send me the community concern in writing. He laughed softly, the way people laugh when they want you to feel rigid. We do not have to turn every neighbor conversation into a filing. Grant, you called a retired planning technician about a protected tree after sending a violation letter. You already made it a filing. That was the first time he stopped pretending we were having the same conversation. He told me the board did not want this to become adversarial. I told him neither did I. He said the entrance needed a cleaner, safer presentation. I said the report supported pruning. He said residents had raised concerns. I asked which residents and what concerns. He said he could not share private complaints. I asked whether any complaint included a certified hazard finding. He said I was making this complicated. That was the second useful sentence of the dispute. People say you are making this complicated when the complication was already there and they wanted you not to notice. After we hung up, I wrote a call summary while it was fresh. Not because I planned to wave it around, but because memory is too generous to people with polished voices. It smooths their edges after a few days. A note does not. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox and found Nina Patel standing in her driveway with a broom, pushing acorns into a small pile like she was punishing them. You and that tree, she said. It was not hostile. It was tired. Me and that tree, I said. She leaned on the broom. Grant says the branches are a liability. Some deadwood needs pruning. I already agreed to that. He made it sound like the whole thing could come down in a storm. Did he show you a report? Nina looked back at her pile of acorns. No. That was the neighborhood in miniature. People were not evil. They were busy. They took the shortest version offered by the most confident person in the room, then went back to groceries and work and grandchildren and leaking dishwashers. If the shortest version was wrong, it could still travel a long way before anyone stopped it. I asked Nina if the west side of her house still got hot in August. Of course it does. Stand in your front room at 4 p.m. and look where the shade line falls. She frowned at me like I had asked her to do homework. I am not trying to recruit you, I said. I just want you to know what you are voting to remove if this becomes a vote. I am not on the board. No. But you are exactly the kind of resident Grant says he is protecting. She did not answer. She swept 3 more acorns into the pile. Then she looked up at the oak. Not long, but long enough that I knew the seed had landed. For 12 days, nothing happened. Then the portal status changed from received to insufficient corrective plan. No explanation. No request for clarification. Just 3 words posted at 7:42 p.m. on a Sunday evening. Insufficient corrective plan. That was the first point where the story stopped being about tree safety and started being about authority. At the next board meeting, Grant introduced the Clean Frontage Initiative. He had slides. Grant loved slides. The first showed the entrance sign with fresh flowers. The second showed 3 houses with matching mulch. The third showed my oak from an angle that made the canopy look like it was reaching across the street to grab passing cars. He did not use my name. He did not have to. We have a few legacy conditions that do not reflect the standard we want for Larkspur Bend from now on, he said. Nina Patel sat 2 rows ahead of me. She turned slightly when the tree slide appeared, then looked back at the screen. Nina is not an unkind person, but she likes things tidy. She had complained once about acorns popping under her tires. She had also told me, during a heat wave, that my tree was the only reason her front curtains were not closed all afternoon. People can hold both opinions at once. Most neighborhood disputes begin there. After the meeting, Grant approached me with a softer version of the same message. He said the board had concerns about safety, visibility, and community presentation. He said the arborist report was useful, but did not address the association's broader goals. A tree can be healthy and still be inappropriate for the location, he said. That is a different issue than safety, I said. He smiled. It is all part of responsible management. Responsible management became daily fines 2 weeks later. The second notice said, my pruning plan failed to resolve the hazard, and that the association could authorize corrective action if I did not remove the tree or reduce it to what they called a compliant canopy profile. That phrase was not in the arborist report. It was not in the covenants. It was not in the city code. It sounded like something Grant had invented because "cut it until I like it" looked poor on letterhead. I did not call him. I did not post online. I did not knock on Nina's door and ask why she had not defended my tree in public. I walked outside with Paul's report and looked at the oak. That sounds simple, but it matters. If the fight is going to happen at a tree, you need to know the tree, not the idea of it. The actual thing. The dead branch over the sidewalk. The low limb that could be reduced. The bark seam where the city tag sat. The roots near the old planting strip. The distance from the curb. The spot where the sidewalk lifted half an inch. The utility line that ran on the opposite side, far enough away that removal was not an emergency, but close enough that careless rigging could make a routine job complicated. I put on old sneakers, carried Paul's report on a clipboard, and treated my front yard like a site inspection. That was how I knew how to stay calm. A site does not care who is offended. It gives you facts, if you are willing to look slowly. First, I found the city canopy tag. It was smaller than people imagine. An oval piece of metal tucked into a crease of bark about knee height. Mr. Havel's note had saved me time there. The tag number was still legible if you brushed away the lichen. I photographed it with a ruler beside it, because photographs without scale invite arguments. Then I photographed the orange survey ribbon that Paul had tied near the deadwood. Not the whole tree, not a romantic picture from the sidewalk, but the exact branches that needed work. A dead branch, a weighted limb, the clearance over the walk. If someone later said I had ignored a hazard, I wanted the record to show the opposite. I had looked directly at it. I measured the distance from the trunk to the sidewalk edge. I measured from the trunk to the sprinkler trench the HOA landscapers had cut 2 years earlier when they replaced the entrance flowers. That trench mattered because root zones do not respect property line arguments. You can damage a tree on one side and act surprised when it fails on the other. I had watched that happen with parking lot trees when I worked for the city. A contractor slices roots for a sign footing, Everyone calls it minor, and 3 summers later the tree declines. By then the invoice is paid, and nobody remembers who said minor. I took one picture of the chip in the sidewalk, where the roots had lifted a slab by less than an inch. That was Grant's favorite visual. He had mentioned trip concerns twice. The sidewalk was real. So was the fact that the lifted section sat beyond my lot line and had already been ground down once by the city. If the association cared about pedestrian safety, it could request a sidewalk repair. It did not need to erase the canopy. I photographed everything. Not because photographs win by themselves. They do not. I photographed because they force you to see what is there. The hard part was not gathering the photographs. The hard part was resisting the urge to send all of them immediately with a long explanation. That is a common mistake. When someone is trying to make you look unreasonable, you help them if you bury the useful point inside a mountain of injured prose. I made a one-page summary instead. Current owner position pruning accepted. Certified arborist recommendation retention with selective pruning. Known city marker canopy, inventory tag visible on trunk. Question: for HOA, provide removal, clearance, or certified removal finding if demanding removal. That was it. I sent that one page to the management company. I copied Grant and the board secretary. I attached Paul's report again because I had learned that previously submitted is where documents go to die. The management company answered with a sentence I have seen in many forms over many years. The association believes it has sufficient authority to proceed. Authority to proceed is not the same as permission to cut. It is also not the same as wisdom. Then I called the city arborist office. I did not ask them to fight my HOA. City staff do not exist to settle neighborhood arguments. And if you ask them to do that, they will usually retreat into language so careful it becomes useless. I asked one narrow question. If a mature canopy inventory tree with an active tag is scheduled for removal by a private association, what does the tree service need to have on site? The woman who answered put me on hold. When she came back, she said any removal of an inventoried protected tree required city clearance unless an emergency hazard had been documented. She gave me a case number and said I could request a field check if work was scheduled. That was all I needed then. Not a ruling. Not a speech. A narrow fact. The second notice arrived by email at 712 a.m. as if an early timestamp made it more serious. It said my corrective plan had been rejected and that the association would arrange abatement if I did not provide a removal date within 10 days. It also warned that any interference with association-authorized vendors could result in additional enforcement. That word, interference, was doing a lot of work. Pause. Long. I printed the notice and put it on the kitchen table beside my one-page summary. Then I made myself breakfast. That may sound irrelevant, but it is not. There is a moment in every property fight where your body wants to turn the whole thing into emergency. The letter wants you to skip meals, skip sleep, and start answering from panic. I had spent too many years watching people make bad decisions at a counter window because a stamped notice had scared them out of sequence. So I ate toast. I watered the basil on the sill. I watched a squirrel climb the oak and drop a twig directly onto my freshly swept walk. Because nature has comic timing. Then I responded, I will not interfere with lawful, properly authorized safety work. I have accepted certified pruning. I do not consent to removal absent city clearance and a qualified removal finding. Please provide both before scheduling any removal activity. No adjectives. No accusations. No paragraph about how much the tree meant to me. The tree mattered deeply, but emotion was not the strongest tool for that step. Grant's answer did not come in writing. The newsletter did. It appeared in inboxes that Friday under the subject line, keeping Larkspur Bend safe and beautiful. It included 3 photographs from the entrance corridor. One showed faded mulch. One showed a leaning signpost. One showed my oak from the least flattering angle possible. Taken in winter, when the canopy looked skeletal and the leaf pile near the curb looked like neglect. The caption read, "Aging vegetation and obstructed sightlines require proactive management." There it was. The shift. Hazard had become vegetation. Pruning had become management. My yard had become part of a campaign. I stared at the photograph for a long time, not because it was persuasive, but because I recognized the tactic. If you cannot win on the exact defect, widen the frame until the exact defect disappears. A tree with 2 dead branches becomes aging vegetation. A pruning plan becomes obstruction. A homeowner asking for clearance becomes someone resisting community standards. That evening, 3 people walked past my house more slowly than usual. One stopped and looked at the tree, then looked away when I opened the door. I did not blame them. They had been invited to inspect me. Nina texted me after dinner. "Is the newsletter about your tree?" I wrote back partly. "Do you have to remove it?" "No. I have to prune it. Removal is what they want." She did not answer for 11 minutes. Then I stood in my front room at 415. "You were right about the shade." That was all she gave me. It was enough. The work was scheduled through a flyer. Grant sent it to the neighborhood list on a Wednesday afternoon. Saturday, beautification walk-through. Volunteers and board members would meet at the entrance at 800 a.m. to review corridor improvements, mulch refresh, sightline clearing, and safety removals. Coffee would be provided. Safety removals. I read that phrase twice. Then I printed the email and put it in the file. Coffee would be provided. That line told me Grant expected an audience. There are 2 kinds of enforcement. One happens quietly because the issue is boring and the board simply needs compliance. The other happens in daylight because the board wants the neighborhood to learn who has the power. Grant had chosen daylight. He did not just want the tree gone. He wanted it gone while people watched him solve the problem. I slept badly Friday night, which annoyed me because I had done everything I could do. At 2 in the morning, I stood in the kitchen with a glass of water and watched the oak through the dark window. The orange X was not there yet. The trunk was just a black shape against the street lamp. For a second, I imagined waking up to a stump. Not because I thought Grant would sneak a crew in before dawn, but because fear is not required to be logical. By 6, I was dressed. Jeans, gray sweater, old walking shoes. Nothing that made me look like I was staging a protest. I put Paul's report, my 1-page summary, the certified mail receipt, and the city intake number into a folder. Then I took half of it back out. Too much paper would look like a performance. I kept the arborist conclusion, the page with the tag photograph, and the city intake number. I put everything else on the kitchen counter. If I needed more, it was 20 steps away. The point was not to win a binder contest. The point was to help the person holding a chainsaw understand the risk before he owned it. At 7:40, I went outside with a broom. That was not strategy. The oak had dropped leaves overnight, because of course it had. I swept the walk clear, including the section Grant liked to photograph. If a crew came to evaluate hazard, I wanted them evaluating the tree, not a pile of leaves I could have moved in 5 minutes. Nina came out while I was sweeping. She wore a cardigan over pajamas and carried the same travel mug she took everywhere. "Are they really cutting it today?" she asked. "They say they are reviewing safety removals." That is not an answer. No. She looked uncomfortable. I thought it was just trimming when Grant talked about it after the meeting. So did several people. Did he tell you he had a crew? Not directly. She looked at the trunk, then at my folder. What are you going to do? Ask the crew leader whether his packet matches the tree. That sounded too calm, even to me. Nina heard it too. And if he says yes? I glanced at the oak. There was a cardinal on one of the lower limbs, bright enough to look fake against the bark. Then I call the city case line and stand where I am legally allowed to stand. Eleanor. I know. She started to say something else, then stopped. Instead, she crossed the street and picked up a few acorns from my curb. She dropped them into her palm like evidence. These are still annoying, she said. I have never argued they were charming. That got a small smile out of her, but it faded when Grant's car turned the corner. On Saturday, I was outside before 7:30. I had Paul's arborist report in a folder, the city case number written on a sticky note, and my phone fully charged. I did not stand in front of the tree. I did not block the street. I sat on the low brick edge of my front bed and drank coffee while the neighborhood performed its usual Saturday sounds around me. Garage doors, a dog barking 2 houses down. Someone dragging a trash bin back from the curb. Birds moving inside the oak like they had not received the flyer. Grant arrived first in a navy polo with the HOA logo. 2 board members came with him. Then the landscaping committee, 3 residents, and Nina, carrying a travel mug and looking like she regretted being curious. He parked beside the clubhouse path, not in front of my house. That was deliberate. He wanted to arrive as the organizer, not the person confronting a resident. He wore sunglasses he did not need because the morning was overcast. 2 board members followed in a separate car. Helen Marsh was one of them. I was relieved to see her, though I would not have said that out loud. Helen did not like drama. That made her useful. The landscaping committee came next, 3 retirees with clipboards. 1 man who always volunteered to spread mulch, and a woman named Carla, who had once measured the height of my rosemary because it leaned over the border edging. They set up the coffee on a folding table by the entrance sign, as if refreshments made the event neutral. Grant greeted everyone loudly enough for me to hear from my yard. We will start with the front corridor and work our way through the priority items. Priority items. That was me. At 8:08, he walked toward my oak with the group behind him. He had not yet looked at me. That was another choice. If he treated me as incidental, the group might too. This is the mature tree we discussed, he said, facing the others instead of the trunk. The association has received multiple concerns about overhang, debris, and visibility. Carla asked, "Is it diseased?" Grant answered too quickly. The issue is broader than disease. That was when I knew he did not have a removal opinion. If he had, he would have said yes and named the arborist. At 8:15, the tree crew arrived. A white truck. A chipper. 2 men in hard hats. Ropes coiled in the back. The sound of the diesel engine changed the whole morning. A truck like that makes a plan feel physical. Until then, a violation is paper. A fine is a number in a portal. A board email is irritation. But a chipper at the curb tells your body that something irreversible has arrived. Marco Ruiz stepped out of the passenger side and introduced himself to Grant. He had a short beard, sun-dark forearms, and a habit of looking at the tree more than at the people. That was the first thing I liked about him. Grant gestured toward the oak. This is the one. Full removal. Marco looked up through the canopy. Full removal. Correct. Packet says frontage improvement and hazard mitigation. Grant's smile held. Yes. The board approved removal. Marco walked to the trunk. He saw the orange X someone had painted there, probably the day before. He frowned at it. Then he crouched near the bark seam and brushed the city tag with his thumb. "You have clearance for this tag," Grant said. "The association has authority to manage common visual standards and safety concerns." Marco stood slowly. "That is not what I asked." Nobody spoke for a second. I have been in enough public meetings to know the sound of a room changing, even outdoors. It is not silence exactly. It is attention finding a new place to stand. I said, "I have the city case number if you want it." Grant turned toward me. "Eleanor, this is not necessary." Marco looked at me. "You, the owner." "Yes." "You objecting to removal?" "I object to removal without proper clearance." "I do not object to the deadwood pruning recommended in the arborist report." That distinction mattered. It mattered because it was true, and because it gave Marco a path that was not emotional. He did not have to decide whether I was stubborn. He had to decide whether his company had been hired to do the right job. He asked to see Paul's report. I handed it to him. He read the conclusion first, then flipped back to the page with the pruning recommendations. He looked at the oak again. Then he called his office. Grant tried to keep talking while Marco was on the phone. He told the small group that safety had to be considered at the community level. He said aging trees created exposure. He said the board had a duty to act before someone was hurt. All of that sounded reasonable if you ignored the fact that the person hired to perform the action had just stepped away from the tree. Nina moved closer to me and said quietly, "Is it dead?" "No. But there are dead branches." "There are." "That is why I agreed to pruning." She looked up at the canopy. For the first time since the slide at the board meeting, I saw her look at the tree instead of the idea of the tree. Marco ended the call and walked back to Grant. "We are not removing this tree today." Grant's face tightened. "On what basis?" "No protected tree clearance in the packet. No emergency hazard letter. Work order says frontage improvement. Owner has a certified report recommending pruning, not removal. If you want deadwood pruning, we can discuss a proper scope. We are not taking this tree down." Grant said. "The board approved the work," Marco said. "The board is not my insurer." That was the sentence that did the most damage to Grant's morning. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was practical. Everybody understood it. You did not need to know the tree ordinance. You did not need to read the original subdivision approval. You only had to understand that the man with the saw did not trust the people who had hired him. Grant tried to reframe quickly. He told the group that I was delaying a needed safety action and that the board would have to consult counsel. He said this was exactly why maintaining community standards had become difficult. He used my name more than once. Eleanor has concerns. Eleanor has chosen not to cooperate. Eleanor has escalated a routine matter. I did not answer most of it. There are times when responding to every sentence only helps the person throwing them. Instead, I asked Marco one question in front of everyone. If the work had been limited to the pruning described in the arborist report, would your crew have started? Marco looked at the report again. Probably. After confirming the tag requirements, pruning is different from removal. Nina said, "So this was not just trimming." Grant said, "The board determined removal was the appropriate long-term solution." For safety. Nina asked. For safety and corridor management. There it was. Corridor management, the phrase he had been trying not to say in front of the crew. I saw one of the board members, a treasurer named Helen Marsh, look down at the work order in Marco's hand. She had not said a word all morning. Helen was the sort of person who could sit through a meeting without speaking and still know exactly where the weak number was. She asked, "Grant, is the vendor packet coded to beautification or hazard response?" Grant said, "Helen, we can discuss internal coding later." That meant beautification. Marco's crew loaded nothing. They did not start the saw. They did not feed a single branch into the chipper. After 15 minutes of awkward conversation, they moved the truck down the block and waited for their office to decide whether there was any pruning work they could properly perform. The chipper went quiet. I had not realized how much noise it was making until it stopped. The quiet did something to the people standing there. Conversation did not return right away. Everyone had been prepared for one of two familiar scenes. Either the crew would cut the tree, or I would make a scene and be blamed for delaying them. Nobody had prepared for a contractor to become the adult in the room. Grant stepped away to make a phone call. He turned his back, but not far enough that we could not hear fragments. "No," he is saying, "the packet is incomplete." Then, after a pause, "Because there is some city tag issue." Some city tag issue. That was how a visible metal marker became fog. Helen asked Marco if she could see the work order. He looked at Grant first. Grant hesitated, which made Helen's expression change. Board members are used to asking residents for documents. They are less used to discovering their own packet has been treated like a private instrument. Marco did not hand her the whole file. He showed her the top sheet on the clipboard. "I am not giving out company paperwork," he said. "But you can see the job description." Helen adjusted her glasses. "Entrance corridor oak removal. View and clearance improvement." She read it aloud without meaning to. Or perhaps she did mean to. With Helen, it was hard to tell. Carla, the Rosemary Measuring Committee member, frowned. "I thought this was a hazard removal." Grant ended his call and returned just in time to hear that. "It is," he said. "Clearance and sightline are safety considerations." Marco looked at him. That is not the same as an emergency hazard. I had liked Marco before. At that moment, I respected him. He was not making a speech. He was protecting the boundary between words that sound useful and words that change liability. Grant lowered his voice. "Mr. Ruiz, perhaps we can discuss this privately." "No need," Marco said. "My answer is the same privately." One of his crew members, a younger man with a red bandana under his helmet, stood near the chipper, pretending not to listen. I wondered how many times he had watched older men decide whether a job was safe. That is how trades teach ethics. When they teach it at all. Not from posters. From watching someone say no when yes would be easier. Nina came to my side but kept her eyes on the crew. "Could they still trim it today?" she asked. "If the scope were correct, maybe." Marco heard her and answered before I did. "We came for removal. I do not have a pruning authorization, root zone plan, or city clearance for work on a tagged tree. If the board wants pruning, they need a different scope." "So, the truck came for the whole tree," she said. "Yes. Ma-am." Nina's face changed. Not dramatically. There was no gasp. She just looked tired in a new way. The way people look when they realize they lent their name to something they had not understood. Grant tried one more angle. "Residents are concerned about falling limbs." Marco pointed up, not with a flourish, just a short motion of his hand. "Then write a deadwood and reduction scope. You do not need a removal crew to solve 2 dead limbs." That sentence traveled through the group faster than any email I had sent. The younger crew member shut off the auxiliary motor on the chipper. The sudden drop in noise made a dog bark 2 houses down. A garage door opened. More neighbors looked out. Public embarrassment has its own weather system. It gathers quickly. Grant saw the audience growing and made the mistake of trying to regain the stage. Eleanor has had multiple opportunities to comply, he said. I felt the old pull to answer everything. To say I had complied. To say I had paid for a report. To say the board had ignored dates. To say the word removal had been hidden until the threat. But the more sentences I used, the more it would look like two residents arguing beside a truck. So I asked Marco, if this were your company's job, what would you need before removing it? He took a breath. I think he understood what I was doing, and I think he decided it was still a fair question. For a tagged tree, I would want city clearance in the packet. I would want the owner's authorization or a clear legal basis for access. I would want the arborist finding that supports removal, not just pruning. And if somebody else is directing us over an owner's objection, I would want indemnity reviewed by our office before the crew unloads. No one spoke for several seconds. That was not a record reading. That was a man in work boots explaining why he was not going to put his company, his crew, and probably his own license history under Grant's sentence. Helen looked at Grant again. Do we have any of that? Grant said, we have association authority. Helen said, that is not what he asked. It was the same sentence Marco had used earlier, and hearing it from a board treasurer made it land differently. The crew stayed for another 20 minutes while their office called someone from the management company. During that time, nothing happened and everything happened. The saws stayed in the truck. The rope stayed coiled. The orange X stayed on the bark, suddenly looking less like an order and more like graffiti. When Marco finally told his crew to pull the cones, one of the residents asked him if the tree was safe. He answered carefully, I am not your arborist. I am saying I do not have what I need to remove it. That mattered too. He did not overclaim. He did not become my expert because I needed one. He stayed inside what he knew. That restraint made him more credible than anyone else on the street. After the trucks rolled to the corner, Grant told the group the board would clarify documentation. He did not say error. He did not say withdrawal. People with authority rarely surrender the first time reality interrupts them. They renamed the interruption. I waited until he walked away before I called the city case line. My voice shook while I left the message. I am not embarrassed by that. Calm is a discipline, not a personality trait. Sometimes your hands know more about the stakes than your mouth allows. I called the city arborist office again and requested the field check. Dana Kline arrived the following Monday at 9:20 a.m. in a city truck with a tablet, a measuring wheel, and no patience for neighborhood theater. I liked her immediately. She greeted me, greeted Grant, and went straight to the oak. Grant had come dressed for professionalism. Same navy polo, different folder. He started to explain the HOA's concern about safety. Dana held up one hand, not rudely, just enough to keep the conversation narrow. I am here to review the tagged tree and the reported removal activity. I am not here to interpret HOA covenants. That sentence did half the work. She photographed the tag. She checked the canopy. She looked at the dead limbs Paul had marked and the larger limbs the HOA wanted removed. She inspected the root zone and asked who had painted the X. Grant said the association had marked the tree for vendor identification. Dana entered something on her tablet. Then she asked for the removal clearance. Grant gave her the HOA notice. Dana read the first page, then said, "This is an association enforcement letter. Do you have city removal clearance or emergency hazard documentation?" Grant said, "Our position is that the tree presents a safety risk. That is not documentation." Again, not dramatic. Better than dramatic. Narrow. Dana reviewed Paul's arborist report. She did not praise it. City staff rarely praise anything. She said it was consistent with what she was seeing maintenance pruning recommended. Removal not supported by the materials present. She issued a stop work notice pending formal review and told Grant that no removal activity could proceed without the proper clearance. Nina watched from her porch. I pretended not to notice. Sometimes people need to watch without being caught learning. The stop work notice changed the neighborhood faster than my letters had. That is unfair. But it is true. People who will not read a packet will read a city notice if it arrives after a crew leaves without cutting. The sequence mattered. If I had simply mailed everyone the ordinance, I would have been the woman with too much paper. Because Marco refused first, the city notice became an explanation for something residents had already seen. By Monday afternoon, the neighborhood had split into 3 groups, which is the usual number for a dispute that has become visible. The first group believed whatever Grant said because Grant sounded like order, and order is comforting. They described the crew's refusal as a misunderstanding. They said vendors are cautious these days. They said insurance makes everyone afraid to do anything. None of that was entirely false, which made it useful. The second group believed the board had tried to rush a removal and got caught. They wanted someone to blame and, preferably, a special meeting where they could say the same angry sentence 4 different ways. The third group, the largest, wanted to know whether their own trees had tags. That was the group that changed the outcome. By Tuesday morning, Helen had received 9 emails from residents asking whether the HOA had an inventory of protected trees. 2 came from people who had voted for Grant's frontage initiative. 1 came from a man on Juniper Court who had been planning to widen his driveway. He wanted to know whether a root zone could affect his permit. A week earlier, he would have rolled his eyes at the phrase root zone. Now it might affect his concrete. This is how education actually moves through a neighborhood. Not as a lecture. As self-interest with a mailing address. Grant sent a statement that afternoon. It said the board was reviewing vendor documentation related to a resident landscaping matter. He did not name me, which was generous in the way a person is generous after creating the public event himself. He also said no final removal work had been authorized pending clarification. That was not true in any ordinary sense. A tree service crew with a chipper had not appeared by accident. But I understood the sentence. He was trying to leave himself enough room to climb down later, without admitting he had climbed up. I did not respond publicly. I sent Helen 1 email. Thank you for asking the work order question on site. If the board reviews this, I am willing to provide Paul's report, the city field note, and a brief timeline. I am still willing to authorize recommended pruning. She replied 20 minutes later. Please send all 3. Also, did the vendor state refusal in writing? I did not have a written refusal. I had what 20 people heard. That was enough socially, not enough administratively. So I called Marco's office. I expected to reach a receptionist and be told everything had to go through the HOA. Instead, Marco called back at the end of the day. I cannot get involved in your board fight. He said before, hello had fully settled. I am not asking you to. Good. I am asking whether your company can confirm that no removal work was performed because required clearance was not present. He was quiet for a moment. That is a narrow sentence. It is the only sentence I need. Send the request by email. I will forward it to our office manager. The office manager sent a 3-line confirmation the next morning. It did not mention Grant. It did not mention me being right. It said the crew declined to perform removal of the tagged oak because the provided packet did not include city removal clearance or a supported emergency hazard finding. It said the company would consider a separate pruning scope if properly authorized. That little email did more than my indignation ever could. It converted the awkward silence on the street into a fact the board could put in a folder. Dana S. field note arrived the same day. It was dry enough to make sand jealous. Tagged mature canopy specimen observed. Removal activity reported. No city removal clearance presented at inspection. Submitted arborist report supports maintenance pruning, not removal. Stop work notice issued pending review. I read it twice, then made myself stop. There is a dangerous pleasure in being proved right. It can make you careless. It can make you want to send one more email than the situation needs. The point was not to punish Grant for being wrong in public. The point was to make the board choose a path that did not require a chainsaw to cover a bad decision. Nina knocked on my door that evening with no lemons yet. Just an apology she had not fully assembled. I told Carla at the coffee table that the tree made the street messy. She said, "It does make the street messy. You know what I mean." I did. She stood on my porch and looked over her shoulder at the oak. The sun was low enough that its shade covered half her driveway. My front room was 6 degrees cooler yesterday than the back room, she said. I used one of those little thermometers from the kitchen. That is very scientific. Do not make fun of me. I am trying to be useful. I am not making fun of you. She folded her arms. I do not want to speak at the meeting. Then do not. But I think I should. That is a hard place to stand. Most people want the benefits of a corrected record without the discomfort of being seen correcting it. I told her she did not owe me a speech. She said it was not for me. That was the third turn in the story. Marco stopped the saw. Dana stopped the work. Helen started the paper cleanup. Nina changed the social weather. Grant sent a neighborhood email that evening. Temporary pause on tree remediation, pending city review. Temporary pause. Remediation. Pending review. No mention of the crew refusal. No mention of the missing clearance. No mention that the removal had been coded as beautification, which I only knew because Helen called me 2 days later. Helen did not apologize. People in board positions rarely start there. She said, "I have a question about the arborist invoice." Mine? No. The Association S proposed removal invoice. It was submitted under entrance beautification. That sounds like a question for Grant. It is becoming one. That was the second turn in the story. Marco S. refusal stopped the saw. Dana S. notice stopped the work. Helen's question started the cleanup. The board scheduled a site meeting under the oak the next Thursday evening. Not in the clubhouse. Under the tree. I do not know whose idea that was, but it was the right one. A clubhouse lets people talk in abstractions. A tree makes them look up. About 20 residents came. More than I expected. Some came because they cared about the tree. Some came because they had seen the chipper leave. Some came because neighborhood conflict is still neighborhood conflict, even when everyone pretends they are above it. Grant opened with controlled disappointment. He said the board had attempted to address a safety concern and had encountered process questions. He said the city had asked for additional review. He said misinformation had complicated the matter. Misinformation is a useful word when you do not want to say the packet was incomplete. Helen asked Marco to speak first. That surprised Grant. It surprised me too. Marco stood near the curb, not under the tree. He kept his hands folded in front of him and spoke like a man who wanted no part of HOA politics. My company was hired for removal. The packet did not include protected tree clearance. The site conditions and owner-provided arborist report did not match an emergency removal. We declined removal. We are willing to bid the pruning recommended by a certified arborist after city requirements are confirmed. That was all. No accusation. No performance. It was enough. Then Dana summarized her field note. Same thing. Tagged tree. No removal clearance. Pruning may be appropriate. Removal not supported by the documentation provided at the time of inspection. Nina raised her hand. So if the concern was branches falling, pruning was an option. Dana said, based on the report I saw, yes. And if the concern was how it looked? Dana looked at Grant, then back at Nina. Aesthetic preference is not emergency hazard documentation. I heard someone behind me exhale. Grant tried to recover by saying the HOA had to think long-term. He said the tree would only become more expensive to maintain. He said residents expected the board to protect property values. He said the entrance corridor affected everyone. That last part was true. The entrance did affect everyone. The problem was that he had mistaken everyone for himself. I spoke for less than 2 minutes. I had prepared more, but most of it was no longer necessary. I said I had never refused pruning. I said I had hired a certified arborist before the HOA hired a removal crew. I said I had submitted the report, offered dates, and asked that any work follow the city process. I said the crew had not refused because I was difficult. They had refused because the packet did not match the work. Then I stopped. Helen asked one question. Why was the removal invoice coded to beautification if this was a safety emergency? Grant did not have a good answer. To his credit, he did not invent one. He said the coding reflected the initiative under which the work had been scheduled. That was the cleanest version of the truth he could manage. The board did not vote that night. Real boards rarely fix themselves while everyone is watching. They tabled the matter pending review. Grant looked relieved to have a procedural word to hide behind. But tabling was not nothing. It meant no removal. It meant the fines stopped accumulating while they reviewed. It meant Helen had the invoice issue in the minutes. It meant Nina and 19 other residents had heard the difference between pruning and removal from people who did not owe me anything. The review took longer than residents wanted. That frustrated people, which I understood, but it also made the result sturdier. Fast reversals feel good. Slow reversals leave a trail. Helen requested the management company's full correspondence history. Another board member, Daniel Cho, asked for the vendor file. Grant objected to the word file because the HOA was not a city agency. Daniel said he did not care what they called it. He wanted to know who authorized a removal order and what basis had been used. That sentence made it into the minutes because Helen was taking notes. The management company produced 3 emails that explained more than Grant probably intended. In the first, he asked for a quote to remove the large oak obstructing the entrance corridor aesthetic. In the second, the manager asked whether the issue was safety or appearance because the vendor needed the scope. In the third, Grant replied that safety language should be included because of overhang and visibility concerns. No one needed to call that a smoking gun. Smoking guns are for court dramas. This was smaller and more common, a preference trying on a safety jacket, because the jacket had more pockets. When Helen told me about the emails, she sounded weary, not triumphant. This is exactly why boards need boring procedures. She said, boring procedures are underrated. No one runs for the board promising better packet review. Maybe they should. She gave a dry laugh. They would lose. The city did not fine the HOA. That disappointed some residents. It did not disappoint me. A fine would have made everyone choose teams again. The city's letter said the association had been advised of the tagged tree requirements and that future removal activity without clearance could result in enforcement. It was a warning with teeth visible, not teeth used. Grant tried to frame that as a win. He told the board that no penalty had been issued, and therefore the matter had been resolved without harm. Daniel asked, without harm to whom. That was the first time I saw Grant look truly tired. Not defeated. Tired. The kind of tired that comes when the room stops completing your sentences for you. The board scheduled a closed vendor procedure session, then a public vote on tree maintenance policy. I did not attend the closed session. I did attend the public one, because policies written after embarrassment have a way of becoming vague if nobody watches the pencil. The new policy was not poetic. It required a protected tree check before any removal. Quote, it required separate scopes for pruning and removal. It required a certified arborist finding for removal unless an emergency condition was documented on site. It required board approval of vendor packets before crews were dispatched to an owner's lot. It required the owner to receive the same work scope provided to the vendor. That last line mattered most to me. If I had seen Marco's packet before Saturday, I could have challenged the mismatch without a chipper at the curb. Grant had counted on the opposite. He wanted the machinery to arrive before the details did. A good procedure reverses that order. During public comment, Carla, from the landscaping committee, said the policy was too cumbersome for routine maintenance. She was not entirely wrong. Rules can become so heavy that no one trims a branch until it falls. Helen amended the policy to exempt ordinary pruning under a certain size when requested by the owner or supported by an existing maintenance schedule. That was a good amendment. I said so. Grant looked surprised when I supported it. He should not have been. I had never been against maintenance. I had been against removal disguised as maintenance. Nina spoke for 42 seconds. I know because she told me later she timed herself in the car. I supported the cleanup because I thought the tree was being trimmed for safety. She said, I did not understand that removal was being pursued, and I did not know the tree was tagged. I would like future notices to say plainly whether the association is discussing pruning, removal, or appearance standards, because residents cannot give meaningful feedback if those words are blended. Then she sat down so fast her chair squeaked. It was not a dramatic speech. That was why it worked. She sounded like a resident who had been used as background support and did not appreciate it. The vote passed 4-1. Grant voted yes. I have thought about that often. He could have voted no and made himself a martyr for efficiency. Instead, he voted yes and called it a clarification. That was his way of surviving. People who care about control often prefer a smaller authority they can keep to a larger one they lose in public. After the meeting, he approached me near the clubhouse door. I hope we can move forward constructively, he said. It was a sentence made entirely of office carpet. So do I said. He waited for more. I did not give it to him. There was nothing to gain by demanding an apology in a hallway. Apologies forced from embarrassed people become another performance. The withdrawal letter would matter. The policy would matter. The pruning scope would matter. Grant's feelings about me could remain his private landscaping project. 3 weeks later, the withdrawal letter arrived. Dear Ms. Voss, following review of city tree requirements, certified arborist recommendations, and association vendor procedures. The violation related to the mature oak at 214 Larkspur Bend is hereby withdrawn. No fines will be assessed. There was more. There is always more. A paragraph about updated review procedures. A sentence about reimbursing reasonable arborist costs. A note that the association would coordinate maintenance pruning consistent with city requirements and owner approval. It did not say Grant had been wrong. Letters like that almost never do. They prefer passive voice because passive voice gives everyone a place to stand. I accepted the reimbursement. I approved the pruning scope. Marco's company came back, but this time with a different packet. Deadwood removal. Weight reduction, On one limb. Root zone protection. City clearance for pruning only. No orange X. Marco was there again. He nodded when he saw me. Better packet, he said. Better job, I said. He smiled at that. Just barely. The work took 4 hours. It was loud, but not the same kind of loud. Pruning sounds like maintenance. Removal sounds like erasure. That may not be scientific, but anyone who has stood under a tree they are trying to save will understand what I mean. The oak looked lighter afterward. Not smaller. Lighter. The dead limbs were gone. The low branch over the sidewalk had been reduced. The canopy still crossed part of the yard and still threw shade over Nina's front windows by late afternoon. 2 days later, Nina brought over a grocery bag of lemons from her sister's tree. It was an odd peace offering, but a useful one. I was wrong about the oak, she said. You were annoyed about the acorns. I am still annoyed about the acorns. That is allowed. She laughed, and that did more for the neighborhood than any board notice. Grant did not resign. People like Grant rarely exit at the moment the lesson becomes clear. His authority thinned instead. Helen started asking for vendor packets before votes. Another board member requested that safety-related work be separated from beautification budgeting. The landscaping committee had to attach source recommendations to removal requests. The portal stopped using insufficient corrective plan without explanation, at least for a while. Small changes. Boring changes. The kind that keep the next person from standing in their yard with a chipper at the curb. That is what I wanted. Not victory in the dramatic sense. Not humiliation. Not a speech where everyone clapped. I wanted the tree left standing if it was healthy enough to stand. And I wanted the process to stop pretending that a preference was an emergency. The orange X faded slowly. For a few weeks, you could still see it in the bark if the light hit right. I thought about trying to wash it off, but Paul told me to leave the bark alone and let time do what time does. That felt appropriate. By late summer, the mark was mostly gone. The canopy filled in around the pruning cuts. Kids waited for the bus in the shade again. Nina still complained about acorns, but she did it with a bowl in her hands because she had started collecting them for a craft project with her niece. Every now and then, I would stand at the front window and remember the sound of the chipper stopping. People think the most powerful sound in a dispute is the moment someone raises their voice. It is not. Sometimes, it is the moment a machine goes quiet because the person hired to use it realizes the story they were told does not match the thing in front of them. That morning, Grant wanted the neighborhood to see control. He wanted a tree removed, a corridor cleaned, and a resident corrected. Instead, everyone saw a professional refuse a bad job. That is a different kind of lesson. If someone tells you a thing on your property is dangerous, do not assume they are lying. They might be right. Branches fall. Roots lift sidewalks. Trees age. Houses settle. Property is not a museum. It has to be maintained. But ask what they are actually trying to remove. The hazard, or your ability to say no. And if the answer feels blurry, slow the work down before the saw starts. Not with shouting. Not with threats. With the right question, asked at the right place, in front of the person who would have to carry the risk. Because sometimes the file does not have to do the screaming. Sometimes the crew leader looks at the tree, looks at the order, and refuses to start